Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Powerless Podcast. In this episode, I talked to Mel Buer, who is a reporter with the Real News Network, has been featured in things like the New York Times, Washington Post, The Nation, and others. We talked a lot about labor struggles. We talked about Sean O'Brien speaking at the RNC, who is the president of the Teamsters Union, and kind of Mel's take on that and mine as well. Talked about kind of what organizing and being politically active outside of electoral politics looks like. What some of Mel's latest work has been, and everything in between. So I really appreciate that she came on to do this recording with me. It was a really great conversation. I hope you all enjoy it. Just as a reminder, you can follow the podcast on all social media at thepowerlesspod. Email me at thepowerlesspod@gmail.com if you want to come on the show, whether you're an artist, musician, producer, activist, journalist, pundit, etc. Always love to have a wide range of people on. So make sure to check out everything there at the socials. It'll all be in the link tree in the notes, wherever you're listening to this at. And I hope everybody really enjoys the episode. Here is Mel Buer from the Real News Network on the Powerless Podcast. This is going to be right in the beginning of this that I'll have to cut out. But just before I introduce you on here, even though your last name is only 4 letters, but I'm awful with pronunciation of last names. How do you pronounce your last name?
Buer.
Buer. That's what I thought, but I knew if I said it, it would be something else. Okay.
It's okay. It's a lot of people go all nuts with it. Buer, Beer, Bauer.
Yeah, so. I would have. I was like, when I was taking notes, looking up some of the work you've done and stuff before this, I kept searching with an A in the middle of it, and I was like, why can't I find this? And that's why I was spelling your name wrong. So that'll
happens.
do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, thanks for coming on. I'm here with Mel Buer, who is a writer for Real News Network. You've also had your own Substack covering U.S. politics, labor, and movements. You've hosted on the Real News Network podcast, had work featured in the New York Times, Washington Post, and many other places. How are you doing today? Thanks for coming on.
I'm doing great. What a time to be alive in this current moment. It's been a good week so far.
Yeah, it's a slow news week. I don't think we're going to have much to talk about. I really don't know of anything that's happened that's important. It's been pretty low, but we'll try our best.
Nothing at all. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to have you on. I've enjoyed your work. I think I initially found you as a journalist, and I think I'd ended up realizing I had read a couple of your pieces before previously, but was from your coverage of labor notes in Chicago back in, was that March? I want to say, I don't know. Time's a blur. April. Yeah. And I remember specifically seeing some of the videos you shared of sort of the, I don't know if impromptu is the right word, but solidarity between the, the labor movement, people there and really assisting and being on the same side as some of the pro Palestinian protesters and demonstrators there as the police got involved. So what I thought would be cool to talk to you about today, again, I talked to musicians and artists as well as journalists and political commentators and pundits and stuff. I'm just going to talk to you initially about what got you started into politics, what got you specifically maybe into labor and away from partisan and electoral politics specifically and all that kind of stuff. And then there's obviously a few news things, both that you've written about or in general, just as someone that writes about labor. We've seen things like Sean O'Brien talking at the RNC. I'd maybe want your opinion of somebody doing something like that and all those kinds of things. But yeah, so that's kind of my spiel there. After all of my rambling, the first thing I usually ask people to kind of break the ice here, since I do talk about music a lot on this as well, is just what, just kind of give me an idea of what kind of music you listen to. What are you currently listening to? Are you a big music fan? Are you going to tell me you're one of those people that says they don't enjoy, what have you been listening to constantly lately?
Most recently, I've been in a sort of, let me put it this way. The way that just because I can often be a bit lazy and maybe your audience might not like this, but oftentimes I find myself in a mood where I will pick a song that I've listened to recently and make a Spotify radio out of it. The algorithm is no longer as fun as it used to be, so it's a bit difficult to try and find new music that way. But the current vibe that I've been on recently is jazz and a lot of blues and some folk music. And right now I'm on a big Nina Simone kick. So,
okay, nice.
But really kind of runs the gamut.
Yeah, I'm sure.
From
just like
punk
with
to
a lot of people,
electronic
right?
to Chet Baker. Really, the vibes for me have been like, how can I cut down some of the noise in my head? And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
far, easy listening and jazz has been the way to do it. So,
I have to definitely remember to do that because again, I'm as well as you. I feel like everybody says this, but like my music taste is eclectic. But like a lot of times, I listen to very heavy music all the time, and I'm also very into like punk or metalcore, all that kind of stuff. And then I also constantly consume doomerism, politics, and world
mm,
news. And it's like sometimes you got to let your brain enjoy something and relax. Not that I don't enjoy metal music, but it's
right,
it's not a relaxing, like calming presence when you're
right.
so that's a good reminder for me to go back and listen to some of my favorite jazz records. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah, you're welcome.
um, but going from there, and folk music also is very on the nose for like a labor reporter as well. I love that.
Yeah.
But going from that, just kind of get me to as far back as you can go. Obviously, you work in journalism, covering labor and political news. Where did kind of your interest for as far back as you can go for politics and both journalism come from for you? Where did you kind of get a passion for that and become interested in those in issues such as that?
Well, for as long as I can remember, I've been a writer. Funnily enough, I got my start in really like long form writing by writing fan fiction in high school. Um,
Nice.
yeah, I mean, it's a great way to cut your teeth. And,
Uh huh.
but really, I would say that sort of my political journey is a bit weird. I grew up in a pretty conservative household, conservative Catholic household. Both of my parents are kind of the big R Republican, small government sort of conservatives.
Yeah.
My grandparents were very active in the conservative sort of political movement in Chicago. So that's kind of the place that I grew up in, right? What that looked like was periods of rebellion in high school where, you get into the sort of punk movement, lifestyle sort of anarchism with really no ideological underpinnings there. It's just about participating in counterculture and
Hmm.
pretending that you understand the politics. Then I would say I had a bit of a conservative turn when I was 19, 20, 21, 22. And a lot of that had to do with my own sort of spiritual journey and trying to understand my place either within Christianity and now without Christianity. And so there was this kind of turn towards the sort of neo-conservative movement at the time, which would have been right around 2012. And then from that point forward, it was sort of rediscovering radical politics and solidifying those radical left politics when I was in grad school in the end of the teens. And
Hmm.
it's kind of moved from there. As far as journalism goes, my dad's a journalist. He's a working class journalist who's been working at the same TV news station in Omaha, Nebraska for 40 plus years. And it really wasn't something that I had my heart set on. Like, I didn't go to school for journalism. I went to school for literature. My
Okay.
master's degree is in literature. And during my grad degree, kind of part time worked as a journalist, sold articles wherever I could, in addition to the teaching that I was doing and the studies that I was doing. And it really didn't solidify for me as a potential true career until 2020. During the pandemic, all of my research plans were essentially lit on fire. I had
Right.
international trips that I had, won grants for that I was planning to really kind of dive into a lifetime of working in higher education that were canceled because of lockdowns and closed borders. And then George Floyd was murdered in May of 2020. And I can remember watching Unicorn Riot live streams from Minneapolis, and feeling like maybe there was a place that I could lend my skills to telling that story. So I
Hmm.
jumped in the car with some other independent journalists and drove to Minneapolis from Omaha and spent 4 days covering the police repression of these movements for justice. And that continued when I got back to Omaha and did the same thing through the whole summer. And that kind of got me started on building the sort of relationships that led to a staff position that I'm on now at the Real News Network. And through all that time, even in grad school, I was podcasting about politics and political ideology. And, coming into my own sort of like Marxist analysis and coming to conclusions about where my own political ideology sort of sat. That is a continuously sort of updating kind of project.
Right.
But yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. I believe that my contribution to a ostensibly left or radical movement or revolutionary movement is the skills I have as a writer and as a media worker,
Hmm.
in elevating and telling stories of the working class. And so now that's kind of the mission that I have really dedicated a large portion of my adult life to now, with the Real News and with the relationships that the Real News builds with other independent alternative media organizations that are working currently.
Well, and thanks for going over that. And one thing I kind of want to ask, because I'm similar in the vein of like I grew up just outside of Chicago on a farm, very conservative area, very religious area. And I found as my as my political consciousness, my political ideology, etc., whatever vocabulary you want to use, has grown. I found that some of like the people I've known, and this isn't like acting better than anybody else or anything like that. I hope it doesn't come off that way, but I found that like there's a way to sort of understand where some of these people, you can talk about, union and labor reporting, where a lot of it can really be. There's a lot of people in the conservative movement, in the kind of small town conservative movement, that aren't necessarily anti-union or anti-labor struggle. You can constantly see, at least on the ground. I don't really think this is the case with like elite like conservatives by any stretch, but that there's like a big dichotomy between a lot of people that will support labor movements or be strong supporters of their union and yet be very conservative in their electoral politics. Have you found, like, kind of growing up in that way and kind of having to maybe grow out of that and grow into your own political ideology, or maybe some people maybe grew up more liberal or left or whatever, that kind of gives you an understanding a little more of like on the ground movements with people and how it's kind of outside of like the electoral politics framework? I know it's kind of a convoluted question, but do you kind of get where I'm coming
Yeah,
from with
yeah.
that?
And I have conversations with family members, most notably my mother, who, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've spent a lot of time discussing, uh, not just conservative politics, but just the sort of spectrum of what it means to be a quote radical leftist, air quotes, right?
Yeah.
And what I've kind of come in, to understand through my labor reporting, through movement reporting in general, which is kind of the wide umbrella of what I focus on, is that we are all in the working class, particularly experiencing the same material conditions, right? So we're all feeling the same problems, whether you're
Hmm.
conservative or liberal or consider yourself part of an anarchist movement, whatever it is, right? What we are feeling under capitalism are the same conditions, right? We're still experiencing gas prices through the roof. We can barely afford to spend money on groceries every month. All of our paycheck is going towards just these basic necessities. 60% of our income goes toward living in a shoebox apartment where we see no upward mobility, right? And what I've noticed is that we may be able to sort of diagnose these symptoms, but some of us are sort of, through our political education, can kind of more accurately call out the actual sort of reasons why we're feeling this way, why capitalism, what capitalism does, saying that it even is capitalism through the conservative ideology. A lot of folks will feel this sort of outward pressure and begin to try and seek out who's to blame. And we just oftentimes don't see eye to eye on who exactly that is. Subsequently, the solutions are then different, right? So,
Hmm.
and we listen to, I don't want to call them political elites, but powerful individuals who have a vested interest in either keeping the system the way it is, or
Hmm.
coalitions of individuals who are interested in changing that system, are all sort of like pointing to different solutions. And so when you sit on a picket line with someone, the focus is not who you voted for. Everyone knows who the sort of enemy is, right? The boss is the person who is dragging
Right.
you into the mud, right? And the solution to that is collective organizing, and the solution to that is asserting your power as a collective body to demand more, and to assert your rights in the workplace, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in a wider sort of conversation, what I found is that, there are many registered Republicans who will have that conversation with you. And it's a matter of whether or not you feel like you can convince them that the boogeyman is not the migrant worker walking across the border, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's, the billionaire who is sowing division in the workplace. And that just takes conversation. Now, granted, I'm not saying that every conservative is someone that you're going to be able to change their mind, nor should you entertain conversations that are, based in prejudice or transphobia or xenophobia. As a matter of course, does that make sense? You know what I mean?
Yes, it does.
But there is a conversation to be had that when you can establish a baseline that says we are all feeling these problems, have you considered that this is the reason why we are feeling that, right? Then you can begin to have a conversation that is far more fruitful than you would otherwise, if that makes sense. That was a bit rambling, but
No, that's what podcasts are here for. That's the long form stuff we want, right? But no, I think that's what I've been thinking about a lot lately too, and I mean, I think it's a lot easier to have these conversations again when you acknowledge some of the problems that these people tend to bring up, which are very valid, right? Like I think sort of especially on the online, but even in person, like, a lot of people will kind of finger wag at each other about what they're concerned about or what the big issues are, when in actuality, unless you're someone that's one of the haves and one of the have nots, you have a lot in line on what you're worried about, right? And I like what you said. I think this is the thing that I think a lot of like pitfalls of sort of the like out of the bounds of electoral politics, left wing groups or individuals that have a following online or whatever the case may be, where you talk about having these conversations with people, but you still have to have the principles, like you said, where like that doesn't mean you stop caring about marginalized groups. That's not the way you exactly get people onto the right side of history either with these things, right? So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to be able to sort of meet people where they're at and try to have a fruitful conversation rather than, this constant like dichotomy, especially with on the ground organizing, of caring about electoral politics, where not caring about electoral politics, but understanding that there's things far beyond that people can connect with you on and probably have a more fruitful conversation and ending of them thinking about the correct solution, like you said, right?
well, and it's worth remembering that we live in a country that still hasn't pulled itself out of the Cold War, right?
Right.
We live in a hyper capitalist country that has spent many, many decades deliberately on a project of, creating a space where communism is a scary word, where
Mm-hmm.
anarchism immediately brings up an image of a bomb thrower, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know that at one time I was very frustrated by the fact that the non-radicals, whatever you want to call them, the individuals that you would hope to bring to your side would hear that you're an anarchist and would just shut the door in your face. And I came
Mm-hmm.
to a realization through my own personal journey of organizing, of which I don't necessarily do actively anymore as I've moved into the space of a full-time journalist. But also just to see on the picket line that if your politics inform the actions you take, instead of you setting up a table at a picket line with a bunch of pamphlets, but instead saying, my politics tell me that I am here to support you, that I am bringing you food every day,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I'm standing here on this picket line and I'm showing support. And you get into conversations with individuals and they ask you, why are you here? Then you can say, well, you know
Mm-hmm.
this is what my politics tell me that I should do. This is what I want to build in my community. You have a far better time of maybe pushing the needle and bringing people into the fold than you do holding on to some sort of ideological purity that is very popular on
Mm-hmm.
online. That isn't to say that online organizing spaces aren't useful, but it's not the only way to convince people that your solution is an appropriate one. And I
Yeah.
find that the nuances are far more plain offline and are necessary in order to navigate what is a complex political situation that affects all of our lives, if that makes sense.
It
Um,
absolutely does. It does.
yeah.
And to kind of go from that to segue a little bit into talking about some of these labor movements that you've covered, various events that you've covered. I did want to get to what I think I had initially messaged you about this maybe back when you and put these videos up about what was going on at Labor Notes. Again, with the solidarity between the union activists and labor reporters and things of that nature, and the pro-Palestinian protesters. I guess in your reporting and what you've observed, both with the campus protests, with union organizing and strikes and things of that nature, have you noticed there be more of a solidarity and overlap there that maybe doesn't get reported on as much? Do you find that there's a lot of people that sort of have this like materialist lens when you're there, like, or I don't know, what's kind of the feel been on the ground between those two things, and have you ever noticed where they kind of overlap at these various events you've been at?
I would say that at its core, what many workers in the Labor for Palestine movement are doing is they are answering a call of international solidarity with Palestinian workers who have consistently asked for solidarity, disruption, just a sense of saying, don't forget that we're here, we're workers too, and we want you to stand in international solidarity with us. What that
Mm-hmm.
looks like from an organizing perspective is pretty varied. You have unions like the UAW who are putting out calls for ceasefires that are lending a lot of weight to the movement by doing
Mm-hmm.
so, to the detriment often of their own sort of position and standing within certain circles in DC, for example.
Right.
But you also have rank and file workers who are trying to leverage their standing as, for example, at the University of California, leverage their standing as workers at the university in an attempt to press forward with divestment conversations by saying the university that has trampled on the free speech rights of employees who are also students who are standing up for Palestinian solidarity, and that is a contract issue, right? And
Right.
they are trying to leverage those sort of clauses in their contract by filing these ULPs. As we know, there is an injunction that's currently running its way through the courts. It's being appealed by the UAW 4811, which is the union that represents workers at the University of California.
Mm-hmm.
And we have yet to see sort of what moves the needle there. But the fact that that's even part of the conversation is kind of unprecedented in this current day and age. But we also
Yeah.
have to remember that there is a legacy of anti-genocide, anti-apartheid organizing, of which unions in this country have played a part,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in the anti-apartheid movement as it relates to South Africa in the
Right.
80s. We had many union presidents and rank and file committees and labor councils that were included in those sort of movements to end occupation in South Africa. So for many workers, this is sort of a continuation of that legacy. But again, like everything else, it's pretty complex, and
Yeah.
individuals are kind of seeing ways in which they can participate in the wider sort of Palestinian solidarity movement. And it is kind of exciting to see the ways in which unions have participated. Obviously, the UAW really is kind of the sort of standard bearer for what that looks like. But I can tell you that rank and file workers behind the scenes are still pushing leadership councils to sign on to ceasefire statements, to be represented loudly and proudly at these sort of anti-genocide protests, right? And to use whatever sort of skills they have as organizers to bolster the movement, which is really cool, frankly.
Yeah, it was great. Like I was, speaking specifically on UAW just at large, I was surprised when I first saw. I think Sean Fain directly said it, or maybe it was somebody else that of them, calling for the ceasefire, kind of applying the pressure that they have when like you're talking about one of the most one of the largest organizing groups in the country, right? And with the scaremongering and rhetoric and people passing things in Congress on basic like speech, it was great to see, and I was surprised by that. And I saw some on the ground coverage of smaller union work. Like you said, I think it was UCLA, right, that you're talking about, at your University of California, doing similar things, and it was just great to see, because I could definitely see the triangulation some labor groups would do of like, well, we don't want to lose the support that we have from people that otherwise wouldn't stand up for Palestinian rights and things of that nature. But I don't know. I think it was like something that pulled me out of being black pilled about this entire thing a lot, was seeing those groups that actually have power when electoral parties won't do anything,
Well,
really put their skin in the game.
right. And I think it's worth noting that in this current political climate, oftentimes we feel pretty helpless when it comes to pushing elected officials to actually pay attention to the will of the constituency, which is kind of what we're seeing with Palestine organizing. I was at Netroots, which is a sort of progressive conference last week, and I was listening to this panel of organizers who represent sort of legal organizations, or who are Palestinian journalists who have since moved to the U.S., individuals who are working within the Jewish community to organize pro-Palestinian or Palestinian solidarity sort of pieces of the movement. And the big thing is to say the movement is growing. There's a point to be made that says that the public will has not caught up to the politics, which has not caught up to the policy, right? And what that means is the more power that you collectively gather by creating a movement that is sustained, that is ever growing, that is constantly sort of keeping its focus on what exactly the demands are, the less chance that the individuals in power have to ignore it. Eventually you can't, right? And so that's kind of where folks are at right now, which is to say, it took years for anti-apartheid divestment to happen at universities, for example, in the 80s, right? Those encampments were put up for quite a long time, and it took a long time for those institutions to come around to the idea. So, the moment is urgent as this genocide continues. And I don't want to denigrate that by any stretch of the imagination, but it's also a marathon, not a sprint. And we have to continue to find ways in which to prevent burnout in the movement, conserve our energy in some ways so that we can continue pushing for the longer term, right? And to think about this in that term, in those terms, I suppose, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It absolutely does. It does. Going kind of from like the flip side of that, I brought this up at the very beginning because I think it happened yesterday or I think it was last night at the RNC in Milwaukee, where, we've got a different side of things with, I think Sean O'Brien's the president overall of Teamsters, right?
Yeah.
Of him giving a speech at the RNC, which I think was the first time a union president had spoken at the RNC in decades, if ever. So what was your takeaway from that? Because obviously with the conversation we just had, people can state that there's things like, him speaking, he didn't, I know at least from the what I read is that, they didn't actually endorse Trump, but he also had the longest speaking time there. He praised JD Vance, all these different things. What was your takeaway from that? I think I saw you were obviously not a fan of him doing that. I think I saw you say a few things online, but what was your takeaway from that? And do you think that was a correct decision at all in any capacity for him to speak there?
Well, emotionally, I'm not excited about it.
Yeah.
And I will say, as a union member, I'm not excited about it. One need only look at a past Trump administration's handling of NLRB appointments, for example, to the GOP as it currently is set up will do in a future Trump administration as it relates to workers' rights and any sort of possible like gains that workers would make under a GOP administration. The calculus feels wonky to me. And I know that there's a not insignificant amount of individuals who will say, well, Sean O'Brien got up in front of clearly not excited crowd of union busters, small business owners, corporate billionaires, so on and so forth, to talk about workers' rights and to try and strike a sort of bipartisan, middle of the road conversation about furthering workers' rights. And they would say, you're run of the mill conservative who's watching the RNC from home might suddenly take that as like a seed in their minds that could then lead to further organizing in the workplace, which, okay, right, that's great. But like, what is the calculus there? Like, what is the cost of that? He O'Brien may be able to secure concessions for Teamsters in the future by trying to play this sort of across the aisle, middle of the road, bipartisan sort of space, but he may not.
Right.
And history dictates that it doesn't really work out when you're trying to court these particular populist candidates or representatives in the Republican Party. And I know that O'Brien has submitted a request to also give a speech at the DNC. So, my question for those Teamsters who are right leaning, who do see this as a opportunity that says, see, Sean O'Brien's on our side, our politics matter, are they going to view him stepping in front of the DNC in August and giving a similar speech as a betrayal? That's
Right.
a question to ask.
Mm-hmm.
So you, it's just I don't understand the utility of it. I'm not saying that sitting in front of the DNC, as I'm sure Sean Fain may give a speech at the DNC in a similar vein as he did at Netroots. As you know, the UAW has endorsed Biden's reelection
Mm-hmm.
campaign. I don't necessarily see that as a good thing either, because the Democratic Party, while being better on labor, you have to concede that the bar is like subterranean.
Yeah.
And even though Biden's administration has been the best on labor in decades, again, that bar is very low. And so, I'm not saying that's a better thing, right? But I do think that in this current political climate, the Teamsters still not endorsing either party, and sending money from their PAC to both parties, donating the same amount of money, may be misguided.
Yeah.
And maybe lending legitimacy to an administration that we already know what 4 years of a Trump administration for workers' rights looks like. It looks like landmark NLRB decisions being rolled back by a Trump appointed board. It looks like, a vastly defunded NLRB that cannot even enforce NLRA protections in a timely manner that makes
Mm-hmm.
organizing more difficult, right? And now we have the fallout from the Chevron decision repeal to kind of
Yeah.
consider in the future and what that means for organizing. It's just going to be tough. And so when you see, an international union president like O'Brien, who has quite a bit of capital, cultural capital, to use the
Mm-hmm.
capitalist term, standing in front of individuals at the RNC, it's tough to understand why.
Yeah.
There's no immediate or potentially long-term benefits to that. And it makes him frankly look like a fool in the eyes of many, many folks, both within his membership and outside of his membership, uh, especially when we know that JD Vance is not a friend of the working class, is most certainly not interested in any sort of pro-labor platform. His voting record attests to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so to stand there and praise that as a VP pick feels shitty,
Feels
you
pretty
know,
gross.
you
Yeah.
know.
I think that was the thing for me that kind of put the nail in the coffin on it. Cause like I was interested when the first thing, when I saw Sean O'Brien was speaking at the RNC, I just like was perplexed. I didn't really know what to think of it. But when I saw that he praised JD Vance, and also, I don't know, like, I don't know how you feel about this as well, because it's like you said, it's not like the Democrats have been great on labor. I think a lot of people talk up the NLRB that they've had, which I think there's been a lot of good people there. I think they've, with what they're given, a lot of times it can feel pretty toothless with what they're able to go after. But it's better, like you said, it's in Mariana's Trench, but it is above the bar of the Republican Party. But I think when I saw that, what worries me overall is people since the Democratic Party, and you know this better than I would, that it's no longer whatsoever really, at least at the national level, a working class party. And so when you don't fill that void, it makes it very easy for a JD Vance or a Josh Hawley or whoever else to kind of prop themselves up as the populists, right? Or like can give little, PR moves to be in front of like a picket line with laborers and stuff like that. There's that video of JD Vance that's pretty famous where I think his
Mm-hmm.
opponent said like, it's your first time here kind of deal going
Right.
for a photo op. And that's what that spoke to me, was like, we're in this place now where a union president's speaking in front of a bunch of like, boat dealers and like capitalists, and it's because there's no like there's no feeling of like a strong labor party within the United States. And so when that happens, you can have these vapid, you know,
It's hard not to feel like
yeah,
the working class is sort of being used as a chess piece.
yes,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
right? When we know that working class, an organized working class, has a lot of political power.
hmm
And so do these party, top party officials.
right,
That's why over the last, 5, 8 years, there's been a lot of work done to court these sort of endorsements or what have you. Right.
right,
But when it actually sort of like plays out, the working class is consistently fucking screwed,
yeah,
constantly, and really, it feels like a distraction
hmm
from what working class organizers, union organizers, the labor movement writ large is trying to do in terms of improving working conditions and living conditions for, uh, you know, all of us. Right?
right,
I get frustrated. My loyalty is to my fellow working class members, right?
right,
And I get frustrated when we get bogged down by this often,
hmm
because at the very least, like the best case scenario, we
hmm
maintain the sort of minuscule level of rights that we have.
right.
That's it, right? And any sort of like movement in a forward positive direction is going to happen with or without Congress and the executive branch saying so. I guess.
Yeah,
Does that make
yeah.
sense?
It does. It does. It absolutely makes sense. I'm right there with you. Going from that a little bit, I guess this would go away from, and thanks for going over that. I don't know. It's a wild time to
It
see a
is a wild time.
Teamsters union
The news
president.
is the news is fucking moving, 500 miles a minute, and the next 4 months are going to be interesting. Let's
They're going
say
to be
that.
hell. Yeah, they're going to be hell, I think. But yeah,
Yeah.
let's go with interesting. That's a better word for it. Yeah. Well, to go on the sort of news cycle at large, we've had a few crazy things happen over the last couple of weeks. I was initially, before we talked, I think last week through email, going to ask you about the piece that you wrote about the debate, which was, I think it shifted the entire public discourse from maybe arguably some more substantial things to Joe Biden's mental health that I think a lot of us have been paying attention to politics have talked about since roughly 2019. But it being on full display, you had a great, you had some great insights in what you talked about in the piece that you wrote a couple of weeks back. But obviously, since then, Saturday we had another crazy update of the presidential election with the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Just from someone that is politically active, pays attention to politics on a professional level. Where has your brain been at on this stuff the last couple of weeks? And do you think this is sort of even more of the nail in the coffin for the Democratic Party at the presidential election?
Good question. Again, news has been moving extremely fast.
Uh-huh.
I find it interesting that what we're seeing out of the Democratic Party is this sort of stepping back of high pressure rhetoric around
Mm-hmm.
Trump's record of fomenting political violence.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, this is, I'm not going to sit here and say that an attempted assassination is a good thing. It's
Yeah.
not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It throws the entire sort of process into absolute disarray.
Right.
And it's kind of been tough to see that in the aftermath, what we're seeing is the Democratic Party is really trying to close ranks around Biden as the nominee. They are trying to push up the roll call for the DNC like within the next 6 to 10 days, which is
Mm-hmm.
wild. And I think I've mentioned this before. The original sort of online roll call was to meet a Ohio ballot deadline.
Mm-hmm.
The DNC are the ones who scheduled the conference, so
Yeah.
they deliberate. I refuse to believe that the people running that whole conference planning did so without knowledge that these ballot deadlines were coming up. right?
Yeah, that's insane. I didn't actually know that. That's insane.
Yeah.
That's
So,
so
and then
ridiculous.
part of the reason here is like they're saying that like California's ballot deadline is coming up, and so we need to make sure that the roll call is in place so the ballots can be printed and so on and so forth. Whatever the excuse is. But
Hmm.
from, and that may be partially true. It may
Yeah.
be part of the reasoning. Um,
Hmm.
but it's also convenient. It's convenient
Hmm.
for kind of shutting down any sort of dissent by saying that these delegates, many of them who are pledged to, majority of them are pledged to Biden. We're going to shut down this conversation and we're just going to make him the party nominee. And that's it, you know. Um, and in the meantime, you see all these reports coming out that top Democratic officials have just resigned themselves to a Trump presidency. Like there's 4 months left, you
We
know.
we just
Let
saw I know it's not apples and oranges, but like we just saw a French election where they literally got together a new coalition and won. And of course, that's not like you can't go apples to apples with that with a U.S. election for a lot of reasons. But it just goes to show, like 4 months, we're like supposedly the wealthiest, best country in the world, and we can't figure something out in 4 months before an election. That's like insane, you
right.
know?
Well, and it's like who's minding the store on either
Yeah,
side, you know.
yeah.
Both candidates that have been furnished by both parties are not great. And we can sit there and we can say it's fascism versus democracy, but it's like different shades of
Hmm.
fascist rhetoric. It's different shades of loss of freedoms. It's just a lot of money floating
Hmm.
around. Um, and again, the working class will be the ones that get screwed. I'm not
Yep.
discouraging people from voting. Absolutely not. And I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, because
Right.
that's not in my purview to do as a journalist. I'm not going to tell you who I'm voting for, but I will say that,
Right.
as a sort of observer to the whole process, every day it becomes a little bit more surreal and a
Hmm.
little bit more absurd. Meanwhile, like the sort of undercurrent of like danger is just like flashing behind you, and it remains to be seen what the rest of this process is going to look like. Either way, it's going to look chaotic all the way up until January,
Hmm.
you know, and we'll see what happens. And
Yeah.
in the meantime, the working class must continue organizing outside of the electoral process. Electoralism is just one tool in the very diverse toolbox and should not be the end all be all of your organizing project, of your community building project,
Yep.
and the top of the ticket is not the only piece of electoralism that matters, right? Um,
Yeah.
the farther down the ticket you get, the closer you get to your own community, and the more that you see that, representatives who are representing, say, for example, in Chicago, aldermen to city councilmen to state representatives, all of them are going to have a real material benefit on you in your community yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So those are the pieces of electoralism that I find to be the most important,
Hmm.
and the most often overlooked, at least from the
Yeah.
left. Do you know?
Definitely. And to that point, like, you brought up down the ballot. That's what I've tried to just, that's what's kept me like sort of engaged in the electoral process is like the down the ballot stuff. And especially in Illinois, like a perfect example of that was during the midterms where I was voting, there was literally like unopposed, like
Mm-hmm.
either unopposed Democrats, unopposed Republicans in a lot of instances where I live. But down the ballot was the direct ballot initiative that Illinois had like the first, enshrined rights in their state constitution of union organizing, right? Of like the right to organize. And like that's where I kept telling people that I knew that just weren't into electoral politics, no, go, because this is actually important. And like it won a landslide, and it was the first time in years I was like happy about something that I voted for, as an
Mm-hmm.
example, right? So
Yeah.
like it's a good example, like and like you said, it's a tool in the chest. And people, I think the biggest thing to get people more engaged in is just the idea of what politics is, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
not voting every 2 to 4 years. There's daily building that can happen that you can see tangible benefits from, right?
Right.
Well, thanks for going over all this. I really appreciate your time on all. The last sort of thing I wanted to ask you about, just because I saw it in the bio that you had, at least on Real News Network, is I saw that it had listed at least that you are working on a book on media, right? What's
The
that? Is Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
the book is on hiatus for now. I'm searching for a new
Okay.
publisher. However, the sort of thought process behind it was, I am a member of a media ecosystem that is very unique in this current
Mm-hmm.
digital age. In many ways, it's the same. In many ways, it's different. And really kind of being a part of these sort of collaborative networks where um, alternative media is deliberately trying to turn away from a sense of competition with each other
Mm-hmm.
to real collaboration in service of a movement such as the one that we have in the United States is really cool. And so what I was hoping to do is kind of draw attention to that, and to do some real kind of like laying out of what that looks like, both within sort of digital nonprofit newsrooms to Twitch streams to podcasts such as this one, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is all kind of working together to build an alternative media ecosystem that is both informative and inspiring.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I continue looking for a new publisher and kind of picking my way through that, maybe I'll have more to update on that book. But,
Yeah.
the world went to shit.
Yeah, I
And
get you.
I suddenly found myself trying to reorient my priorities
Yeah, of
currently.
course.
Yeah.
No, but I wanted, because it sounded like, at least from the premise, it sounded like a very cool idea on something that, of course, people have been writing here and there about these sort of things, but to see a book on that kind of new era of media in general is just a really cool idea. So I'll be hopeful to see updates on that when you get around to it. But again, just a really cool idea, and I hope it all works out really well. Last two things, just if you can, just go ahead and share where people can find you, find your work. And everything in between there. And then lastly, since I do talk to musicians and talk to artists and stuff on here, I always play music at the end. And so even when it's not a music episode, I let the guest, pick a song to play at the end, whatever artist, whatever you can think of. That's just one that you would like to have on at the end. So yeah, just plug your stuff and tell me what song you want to play at the end of this.
Sure. Yeah. You can find me on Twitter at Mel_Buer. That's Buer. I am co-hosting a couple of podcasts, including the newly minted co-host of the Working People podcast on the Real News Network. You can find my writing mostly on the Real News, and hopefully elsewhere as we move forward into the rest of the year. Yeah, send me an email at mel@therealnews.com if you want to yell in my inbox. I'm usually pretty responsive. Not so responsive to social media DMs. I'm trying not to spend so much time on Twitter.
It's a good call.
Yeah. But yeah, I think in true labor movement form, I would love to hear Solidarity Forever by Pete Seeger. That would be
Perfect.
my
I was hoping you'd pick some
outro.
staple union song. I absolutely love it. All right, well, Mel, thanks again so much for doing this. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the Union makes us strong. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the Union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of atoms, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the Union makes us strong.